The first time I met Mark, he was flying a sign on a street corner that my family would drive past almost every day. One of my daughters gets hypoglycemic, so we kept a box of protein bars in the car for her to snack on as needed. Somewhere along the way, we started giving out handfuls of them to panhandlers and other homeless folks that we encountered, usually at stoplights. Mark was one of our regular customers because he was out there every day with his sign. It wasn't until later that we learned he couldn't eat them. He didn't have any teeth, so he couldn't eat hard foods. But he would take them anyway and give them away to other homeless people. The protein bars evolved into bags of food that added fruit cups, pudding cups, a few other things I can't remember, and during the summer, bottles of water. As usual, Mark was one of our regulars. One day we pulled into a small parking spot behind where he was standing, and I asked his name. It had occurred to me that so many of these people are faceless objects to most of us, nobody really cares who they are. Learning a person's name is something important because think about it. Your name is a big part of your self-identity. Yeah, yours too. When I think of myself, I don't think random bipedal hominid. I think David. It's who I am. Same with you. And it's the same with every homeless person you encounter. I was always really bad with names until I realized why. It just wasn't that important to me. But if remembering your name isn't that important to me, I'm saying you are not that important to me. So I went on a personal campaign to get good at names. The project is ongoing, and I digress. As time went by, I started spending more and more time on that corner talking with Mark. We had a major thing in common, music. He was always singing or humming a random line from some song because he had music in his head non-stop. I could and can empathize with that, and we hit it off right away. In the weeks that followed, he showed me a side of my town that most of us never even realize exists. There are big patches of undeveloped land all over the Tacoma area, and pretty much all of them provide refuge for people just looking for a little spot to pitch a tent and try to survive. He introduced me to a couple in their 40s who had both been addicted to heroin for over a decade. The gentleman had just started doing methadone treatments to try and get off the needle, while the lady couldn't bring herself to make the attempt. She was also bipolar and would sometimes disappear for weeks at a time. Over the next 3 years, I watched them split up, get back together, split up again. At one point, he had gotten completely off heroin and was in his own apartment. She had vanished again. When she came back, he gave up the apartment and returned to homelessness to be with her because his agreement on the apartment wouldn't allow him to bring anyone else in. Think about that kind of love and devotion the next time you have an argument with your significant other. Through him, I met Bree. When Bree turned 18, her parents booted her out of the house with no support, no prospects, no job, nowhere to live. I was reminded of some of the critters in the wild that just abandon their young as soon as they produce them. It wasn't long before the seamier side of life got hold of her. She was now 22 and a committed heroin addict. She lived in a tent with a man who was probably twice her age, but he kept her supplied. This little girl looked me in the eye and said, "I don't have anywhere to go. I can't make a life for myself. My life is pretty well over. May as well just give up and do drugs. At least that feels good." There are no words to describe the knife that went through my heart when she said that. It wasn't long before I found out that Mark played bass guitar and also had a twin brother who was also homeless with his wife, and he played drums. I had some of both in my studio, so Mark started coming over regularly so we could jam and generally have fun. When possible, his brother would join us and we were talking about forming a band. We had some pretty good stuff going. It was during those times that I managed to piece together how Mark got to where he was. He was born in a small town, I believe in Mississippi or Alabama. Some parts of his story were a little vague. His dad was a part-time law officer and part-time preacher. Somewhere during his childhood, his mother developed a roving eye and divorced his dad. Now the twins, as well as their 2 other brothers and their sister, were without a father figure. The twins started hanging out and playing at a motel nearby, even though their mother told them to stay away. They didn't do it, and before long their mother had married the man who ran the motel. Their disobedience had gained them a stepfather. And what a stepfather! Not only was he verbally and physically abusive to all of them, including Mother, he did some of the most unspeakable things to those boys that anyone could imagine. Mark never went into specifics, but more than once he mentioned kiddie porn. By the time Mark was 13, he couldn't take it anymore. He ran away. His plan was to make his way across the country to his real dad, and he eventually succeeded, but it cost him dearly. Over the next couple of years, he hitchhiked, walked, and worked odd jobs to get across the country since his dad was here in Washington. One of those odd jobs was working as a carny. He was with one of those traveling carnival operations, the kind that set up rides at county fairs and all that stuff. He was doing fine until one day his boss decided he had too much energy and was cutting up too much. Mark was 15. That's a thing 15-year-olds do. But this guy didn't think so. He had a bunch of other carnies hold Mark down and shot him up with China white heroin against his will. He told me more than once that heroin is one of those rare drugs that when you get your first taste, you either love it or you hate it. He didn't hate it, but he knew better than to go down that road. He found his dad, got settled, grew up, got married, got divorced, got married again, fairly typical. Then one evening, it all changed in an instant. He had gone with a friend to a truck show. His friend had built and customized a pickup and entered it in the show, and Mark was there to help and support him. Sometime after nightfall, they were driving down a highway headed home, going about 70, when both front kingpins on the pickup broke. The front wheels went like this, and the truck stood on its nose. Mark's friend who was driving lost both legs. They were crushed when the entire firewall ended up in his lap. What about Mark? Well, for several minutes after they arrived on the scene, the first responders didn't even realize he had been there. It wasn't until a paramedic examined the breakage pattern on the windshield that he realized, as he put it, either there was something really heavy on that passenger seat or we have another victim around here somewhere. They found him several hundred feet down the road. His seatbelt had snapped, shattering his collarbone. His chin hit the dashboard, breaking his jaw in several places. From there, he went face first through the windshield, and who knows how many times he bounced. In the end, he lost most of his left lung because he had broken so many ribs. His collarbone had to be rebuilt, and his entire face was held together with screws and wire. He lost all his teeth, and his jaw had been so badly broken there was no way it would heal properly, so dentures weren't an option. He was destined to gum soft foods for the rest of his life. He was in his mid-20s. He was also in unbelievable pain. By the time they released him from the hospital, he was hooked on opioid painkillers, and I think we can all see where this is going. As so often happens with our lovely American healthcare system, once they decided he was well, they gave him the boot, no support, no backing, and no more steady supply of pain medication. The surgeries were finished, but the pain would never be finished. In desperation, he turned back to heroin. He told me he never expected or intended to get addicted, but he did. It was hard to get clear answers out of him, but he was a heroin addict and sometime dealer for over 15 years. At his peak, he was doing $300 a day in heroin. He said it took 5 syringes just to get him going in the morning. He divorced his second wife and left his 2 children because he felt he wasn't good enough for them. He was nothing but a hopeless junkie. He regretted that for the rest of his life, but by the time he realized what he had done, she had remarried and his kids hated him. From then on, he told all his friends, "I'm married to heroin." He was also fairly unique among his peers. Everybody on the street knew Uncle Mark. If you needed something and he could help supply it, he'd do it. That meant food, a blanket, clothing, drugs, money, whatever he had, he was willing to share freely. I often said if he had a nickel in his pocket, he was looking around for someone to give 2.5 cents of it to. I knew that if we could pull him up out of this life, he wouldn't go alone. He'd grab another homeless person with each hand and try to drag them up with him. He was one of the most selfless people I ever knew. He went to prison more than once for his heroin use, and while he was there, he took some college courses in forensic anthropology, of all things. He never did anything with it, but knowledge is never wasted. He had no regrets about it, and he shouldn't. When he got out the last time, he was clean and sober and not interested in going back, but before long the drug got its hooks into him again. He called heroin the black bitch of hell, and he watched dozens of his friends die from it during his addiction days. I never understood how that works until Bree explained it to me one day. She said, I didn't even take that much, but you know how with heroin sometimes you just get so relaxed you forget to breathe? That's how it kills a person. Respiratory failure. The body is so depressed it can't keep breathing. That part didn't really make me respond, but then she said the thing that made me cringe for the only time I ever did while talking with a homeless person. She said, that's the last time I shoot up in my neck. Still makes me cringe. Thankfully, Mark didn't have to watch her die, but he watched many others, and he knew if he went back to it, he'd be one of those someday. So after he got clean the last time, he stayed that way, and by the time I met him, he was in fairly decent shape. But since he had been to prison, he was also on probation and had to check in with the Department of Corrections, or DOC, on a regular basis. Now, Washington's laws are really weird, and I don't understand them. If you have a solid address, which is to say you're not homeless, you only have to check in with your DOC officer once a month. If you're homeless, you have to check in every week. That does not make sense. The person with a home is way more likely to have reliable transportation as well, so it's usually not a major problem for such a person to get to the DOC office to check in. A homeless person, on the other hand, is probably on foot. It's impossibly difficult for such people to get anywhere, much less do it weekly. And if you miss a check-in, they can just pull up and yank you off the street and throw you in jail for 30 days. I know this because I watched an arrogant little prick of an officer do just that to Mark. He was smiling and laughing as he handcuffed my friend while a county sheriff just stood by and watched. The thing is, and the thing neither of these little sacks would listen to, is they were endangering his life by doing this to him. To explain that, we have to back up. He finally got off heroin, but he paid a huge price for it. By this time, all the veins in his arms and legs were destroyed, and he couldn't shoot up in any of them. So like an idiot, his words, not mine, he started shooting up in his femoral arteries. Now, an artery is very different from a vein because an artery has a pulse of its own, so the vessel wall is constantly expanding and contracting. You weaken that vessel wall with a bunch of needle holes and you're looking for trouble. Mark not only went looking for trouble, he found it. He went to shoot up and saw that his left femoral artery had a bulge in it the size of a golf ball. He knew he'd better get to the emergency room quick. Just as doctors came in to examine him, the artery burst. Blood sprayed everywhere and he was in the process of bleeding out. A quick-thinking doctor put her finger in the artery and stopped the blood loss until the other doctors could deal with it. They couldn't repair the artery, so they had to tie it off up here in his lower abdomen. That meant he now had no major blood flow to his left leg. So on top of all the other pain he had been living with for all those years, now he had to deal with a constant pain and burning sensation in his leg and foot. The doctor who worked on him told him if he ever shot heroin again, it would kill him. On top of the pain, his leg was also prone to infection. One day, about a week before the arrest I described, he had called me up and begged me to let him come over and hang out because he'd had a fight with his brother. I went and picked him up and brought him here to the studio, but he seemed really lethargic and out of it. That was what caused the fight with his brother, because he was so out of it, his brother figured he must have gone out and gotten a fix. That wasn't it. He said, "My leg is weeping so bad, my pant leg is drenched." My radar went up. He showed me, and I immediately called my wife, the nurse, to come out to look at it. Half an hour later, we were in the ER, and his brother felt like the worst person on earth. Mark was actually deathly ill, and the infection was screwing with his head, and he accused him of doing drugs. I explained that there was no way he could know this without any training. But the next problem was what to do with Mark after he got out of the hospital. brother and wife, as well as their adult son, had been staying with a family of 3 in a one-room apartment. Mark was staying with them as well, but that many people in a one-bedroom apartment meant he slept in an easy chair, which meant he pretty much didn't sleep at all because of pain. The hospital discharged Mark after 4 days of treatment. He was still sick and vulnerable, but their attitude was, "Oh, we discharge homeless people back to the street all the time." Apparently that makes it all right. I know that hospital intimately, and they have a department that's supposed to help people like Mark find some place to go. Despite repeated requests, he never heard from anyone in that department. DOC wouldn't let him go back to the apartment with his brother, and if he went back to the street with that infection still raging, he'd be dead before long. That was when I said, this is not going to happen. We have an extra room in our house right now. He's coming home with us to be part of our family. DOC examined the place and approved, and now we had crazy Uncle Mark living with us, and we all loved him. I got him to his monthly DOC check-ins until he had fulfilled his obligation and finally got out from under them. It was one of the happiest days of his life. He had been living with us for less than a week, and we were down at his old stomping grounds visiting some friends of his when these clowns came barreling up, ran their SUV up onto a busy sidewalk, and grabbed Mark. We explained to both officers that putting him in jail would likely put him back in the hospital. The sheriff deputy's hands were tied. He was just there for backup and didn't have any authority. So I explained it to the self-important little dickhead who was in charge. He said, "I'll call his officer and see what she says." He was lying. He pretended to make the call, and even if he did, he got an answering machine because we already knew Mark's officer was in a seminar all day. I told him he was lying, and he brushed it off. They took him away. This is what Washington's Department of Corrections can do to you, with your legislature's approval. Washington, we need to get on the stick because this is just not right. Thankfully, he came out of that all right. For the next 3 years, he was the brother I never knew I had. He and I were so close, it was as if we had grown up together. We played music, we visited his friends on the street, we helped his brother when we could, and we were working toward getting him into his own place. Step 1, get him some income. We got him set up on food stamps at once, and since he was clearly disabled, we were able to help him get onto SSI. Now, for some reason, your government thinks a disabled person should be able to make rent, utilities, food, transportation, medical care, and all the rest on a little over $700 a month, which proves that none of these decision makers have ever tried it. Getting onto Medicaid took care of his health matters except for his pain management. For his pain pills, he would go to a doctor that should be turned in as a pill pusher or drug dealer. He only deals in cash and doesn't seem to care what your excuse is. If you can give him a good enough story and the right amount of cash, he'll prescribe you all the opiates you want. Since they did come from a genuine prescription and he wasn't buying them off the street, we kind of had to look the other way. We all knew how much pain Uncle Mark was in. We didn't like it, but we tolerated it for his sake. The best thing that could happen would be to get his leg fixed so he didn't have the pain anymore, so we set about making that happen. A brilliant surgeon fitted him with an artificial vein. For the first time in 8 years, he had sufficient blood flow to that leg. He could walk like a normal person, and his pain, while it wasn't completely gone, was lowered to a level that ibuprofen could deal with. He couldn't have been happier. The biggest problem Mark had was he couldn't let go of the old life. He would invite one of his old friends from his drug days over to play music, and it would be a disaster. These guys were more interested in trying to get Mark back into their world than they were in seeing the benefits of his world. When he acquired a vehicle of his own, Mark started going to a certain house and hanging out with these guys. One night he stayed overnight, and when he woke up, something was wrong. He had a bulge right here in his shoulder. I had a feeling I knew what it was from, but I didn't want to think about it. Before long, his leg was weeping again, too. This time, he was in the hospital for 7 weeks. He had developed a massive infection in that shoulder, and it had migrated to his leg and attached itself to that plastic vein. The vein had to come out and his artery was tied off again. He was right back where he started because that was his one chance for that leg, and I'm sorry to put it bluntly, but he blew it. When he finally got out of the hospital, he was a different person. We knew the infection had messed with his head, but it took us a while to realize how badly it had messed with his head. He became gruff and aloof, almost mean. He also became selfish and defensive. He started buying pills from one of his friends. As I mentioned, my wife is a nurse. If the authorities were to come into this place and find illegal drugs, even if she had nothing to do with it, she could lose her license. I begged him to stop, but I couldn't physically stop him, so there was no way. He just quit telling me when he was doing it. Then one day, I drove him to pick up his usual prescription, and he said he had to go see this friend because he owed him some pills. I had the bottle and asked him how many he needed to give the guy. He fought me about it and insisted you have to show the bottle when you're doing this sort of thing. Reluctantly, I gave him the bottle. When he came out, he was all smiles. He explained that not only had he paid his friend back, he sold him a few extras so he had some money in his pocket. I sort of went ballistic on him. I told him he had betrayed my trust and this would never happen again because I would not drive him to any such place again. He was pretty deflated, not to say a little devastated, but that was nothing compared to my wife's reaction. At this time, he had moved from inside the house to the little room that is now my studio control room. She stormed out here and pounded on the door. He said, "Who is it?" And she screamed loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear, "Me, open the goddamn door." When he did, she was in his face and she was not nice about it. She informed him if she ever learned of him pulling drug deals again, he would be out on the street before he knew what hit him. Now, Mark respected me. He was afraid of her. He told me later, while his voice was still shivering in terror, that it never occurred to him that was a drug deal. I said, "Mark, they're drugs and you sold them illegally. What else would you call them?" It got impossible. He wouldn't stop buying the illegal pills and bringing them home. We couldn't allow that on our property, so it was a sad day for everybody when Uncle Mark had to go. But it was even sadder because he wasn't our lovable, crazy Uncle Mark anymore. Whoever that guy had been, we had lost him. He told us he had found a place, and over the course of a few days, he moved out. When we cleaned his place out, we found tons of what they politely call drug paraphernalia, which is to say he was doing heroin again. I only spoke to him one more time after that. He called me out of the blue from a number I didn't recognize and said he was living in a tent. I was pretty disappointed, but that life was what he wanted. It was what he knew best and where his comfort zone was. There wasn't anything we could do about it. The next time I heard anything about Mark, it was one of our mutual friends telling me he was dead. During his addiction years, he lived for a long time in a tent with another brother of his who was also addicted to heroin. His brother developed kidney trouble and had to go on dialysis. He was miserable all the time, and 4 days after Mark got out of prison, before he could get to the hospital to see his brother gave up and died. But Mark had seen the awful life his brother had living on dialysis. Well, not long after he moved out and returned to his old ways, Mark went into kidney failure. When his doctor informed him and told him he would need dialysis, Mark said no. He was staying at a friend's house, and one night he went to sleep and just didn't wake up. A lifetime of drug abuse and living on the street caught up with him, and his body couldn't handle all the things he had done to it. He died a few days before Christmas, a couple of months after his 54th birthday. Why am I telling this story? Because people need to know this man existed. People need to know that people like him exist right now. And people need to know this is not, or should not be, an acceptable situation. Mark made a lot of choices and lived with the consequences, but many aspects of America failed him as well. For starters, as a child, he didn't feel there was anyone he could go to and tell them what his stepfather was doing. He knew they wouldn't believe him because the man was a respected member of the community, as they say. He felt that running away was his only choice. He should have been able to go to the police and tell them what that carnival boss did to him, But again, he knew the local authorities wouldn't believe him and would probably bust him for drugs no matter the situation. Again, the respected member of the community versus the kid, and teenagers in particular, are always prone to lying. The truck accident is a notable exception. Nobody could have foreseen that, and special props to the first responders who realized he was there and found him. But after that, the healthcare system failed him miserably. We have nothing at all in place to follow up with people like him and help make sure they don't end up turning to something like heroin. As it sits right now, someone like Mark is just dumped right back into their life to fare as best they can with basic family doctor care, even though there's nothing basic about the care he needed. Contrary to what some say, our healthcare system sucks balls. Healthcare for profit was never a good idea, and it's what led to Mark's situation. We have got to change that. The legal system failed him when they just threw him in prison instead of helping him get clean. The second time he went, he didn't even have anything on him. He had an empty bag that the cops assumed had heroin in it. They ran him in, a public defender convinced him to plea bargain, and away he went. Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, people! Our punitive legal system also sucks rocks because for the most part all it does is harden people instead of helping them find a better way. That has to change. Our public assistance safety net system failed him. Washington has a housing assistance program called Section 8, but it looks more like the military definition of Section 8. It's hideously underfunded, the process is impossibly complex, and the waiting list is years long. Meanwhile, I can drive around Tacoma right now and see at least 2 empty houses on every block, many of them abandoned. Why can't we fund Section 8 sufficiently so we can start putting people into those homes? State legislators, I'm looking at you. Part of the reason we were never able to get Mark into a place of his own is because his wait in Section 8 was 7 years. That's insane. Fix it! In the end, Mark failed himself. We like to say Mark has big plans. He always had multiple projects going around the place, all in a state of got started and never came back to it. He had a stack of bamboo sticks that he was going to make into canes for homeless people. He snagged what he decided was an antique chair from somewhere and was going to restore it and sell it for a hatful of cash. It sat in my carport for 4 years. He was an accomplished artist who could draw anything but wouldn't try to make any kind of profession out of it. He was going to clean out our gutters, so he took all the downspouts apart. The gutters have trees growing in them, and someday I'll get around to putting the downspouts back together. Mark's biggest failing came in follow-through. He just never did any. He was always looking ahead to the next project instead of finishing the one he was on. He wanted to learn how to play music the way I do. I can literally hear something once and then do a fair job of playing it back to you. He wanted to know how to do that. I taught him how to read a chord sheet and play it on his bass, and he decided that was enough. When I tried to teach him more and started getting into theory and ear training, he quit. He already knew it all. He wouldn't follow through, even though he continued to complain that he wished he could do what I do, and we had to get back to the lessons one of these days. That was our crazy Uncle Mark. I guess you could say this story is part call to action and part cautionary tale. If there's something you want to do, stop sitting around planning it. Do it! That's why I've started putting my music off on this channel. I've had some of these songs in my pocket since the early 2000s, and I'm going to do something with them someday. Mark taught me that someday never gets here. I have today, and that's it. So I would do well to get off my keister and do the things I want to while I can. Mark wrote a cool little instrumental thing that we would use as a warm-up. I helped him develop it, and we had something that was potentially quite good. He called it Freedom Fly. We never got around to finishing it with lyrics or something like that, but it was pretty good standing on its own. I laid down the bass part, and right now I'd like to finish this video by playing it for you. It seems like an appropriate little tribute to the brother I didn't know I had. I miss you, Mark. Rest in peace.